So, welcome to our Dharma program. And let's get rid of that guy there. Oh. So, we're presently studying something that we needn't actually look for. So what we're studying here is something that's taking place every moment. And that is essentially our experience. So our experience is filtered through what we could call our consciousness. And we're brought up in a culture where we have a lot of science, a lot of analysis. So that's something we're used to. But in the case of Buddhism, which also operates with analysis and a science, the domain is actually the mind. That mind which we experience with every single moment. So let's say that you were doing some research on, what can we say, the human body. Then actually we sit with an awareness of this is our own body, but very often we have a model in front of us, and so we're kind of thinking that the domain that we're studying is represented by the model in front of us, and that's fair enough. But there's a sense of a little bit a distance to the material. We might, for example, be studying the kidney, we might be studying the heart, the lungs, whatever, and then we're looking at that model or that drawing. And so we're used to kind of have the subject somewhat represented in an abstract way. Or, for example, if we're studying plants, we might be looking at pictures of plants. So we might be looking at something that's related to geographical locations. We're looking at pictures of geographic locations. So we think that we generally relate to the object of what we're studying out there. In the case of what we're studying in Buddhism, we're actually studying what is right here, right now. So we actually have an actual empirical experience of what we are studying. It has to do with what is immediate. So that's very different from the kind of studies where we very often, we might actually be studying what's happening with things in, let's say, Argentina or England or whatever, and we're kind of just sort of, our mind goes there, but we're quite clear on it. In the same way, actually, when we're studying the Buddhist mind, we actually should be quite clear, because if we, for example, say subject and object, let's say I say I'm looking at the wall, then there's two things that are implicit in that. There's my experience, the subject, and the wall. So it's very sort of immediate. We're not really talking about anything that's foreign or abstract. So then we might, for example, as we've been doing here in the study of the Abhidharma, then we actually, with regards to something as immediate as that, we also include the faculties. So for example, I would say, I'm looking at that wall over there with my eye. That's the eye that I have here. There's the wall over there. And then there's the conscious image that's generated in my mind, which is white wall. Now, we could actually say the white wall doesn't really have any kind of idea of being a white wall or anything. And we would actually say we could break this down in particles. And so we have an interesting phenomena that we call qualia, which is our appreciation and construction of this particular phenomenon on the basis of our faculty. So we're essentially operating with the eye, the object, and none of these actually, neither the eye nor the object itself thinks white wall, but the consciousness that's experiencing that is what generates white wall. And then we could say, well, we might say that's a completely neutral phenomenon, but maybe we actually really don't like white walls. And in which case, we're sort of operating with the notion of this wall should be different. And so then we actually might have aversion. Then we might think white wall is really beautiful, and we might have attraction. But again, that has nothing to do with the white wall itself. So in this way, we very often include the individual like and dislike. And with that also, we begin to say good and bad. And on the basis of that, we might have reactions of various kinds. But when we talk about this, feeling, perceptions, ideas. We're not talking about something abstract or something foreign. We're talking about what's happening right now. Yeah. So that's where there's a very immediate experience of the topic that we're talking about. So the subject matter that we're talking about in Abhidharma continually comes back to this immediate dimension of what's happening right here, right now. But there is something that gets in the way of our experience of the world. And this is what drives suffering. And this is what, in the Buddhist teaching, we would say this is where all the various kinds of suffering there is in the world comes about. And that is what we call ego. It's me. I am very important. I am very interesting. Did everybody see me? You know, the kind of the notion of being something special. And we operate throughout our lives continually with this sense of what's in it for me. And of course, this might sound rude, and we might think, oh no, I'm a very selfless person. I'm really thinking about others. And whenever I have the opportunity to serve others, I do it, and so on. But we have to admit there is a very strong sense of self. And we could actually, if we're sensitive enough, we could see when we're making a big deal out of ourselves, then we actually have a rather difficult life. And when we're sort of more easygoing and don't take ourselves too seriously, we actually have a lot more fun. We have it a lot easier. So we have this understanding, again, coming back to what is immediately happening, of something called ego. And that is very much why we study the Abhidharma, to begin to see that this notion of ego is actually this is actually constructed by a number of different factors. And that's why it makes sense to begin to look into the object, look into the subject, look into the organ, the consciousness, and so on. The more we deconstruct this sort of what appears as a unitary experience, that we just say, I like, I don't like, I'm out of here, I want this. The more we begin to see that these are actually made up of different factors, then we begin to be become less controlled by these various impulses. We become also less controlled by this self-centered perspective. We begin to have more of an aerial perspective. And in Buddhism, we call this aerial perspective for vipassana, but it's also synonymous with what we call wisdom. It's where we begin to simply see things clearer, less from a point of view of a self-centered perspective, and more really understanding the conditions that are present in the situation. So this sounds very abstract, but let's say that I'm standing in a queue and somebody steals my place in the queue. And we all might experience that. I don't know. But, you know, that's sort of where we potentially could become annoyed. And, or maybe a parking spot. We've been looking for a parking place for a very long time. We're in Mullumbimby, and where you famously can never find a parking spot. And then finally, you actually find a parking spot. And just as you're about to sort of turn in, then the guy coming from the other direction sort of goes right in and takes it in front of us. And we think, you know, we think something rude. Now, the experience is anger or irritation or resentment, and that's normal. The example I'm coming with here is very benign. It could be much worse, but let's just say something as benign as that. Then, if we begin to see what is involved in the situation, it's really just another person doing something where we have no idea actually what's involved from their side. They might actually be maybe busting to go to the toilet, or maybe they have a kid that's, you know, throwing a tantrum, or, you know, there's all sorts of little things that come in. And the more we understand that, maybe we ourselves haven't eaten, we haven't had a coffee yet, or we in some way are challenged in some awful way, and that then also influences this experience where we're just having a unitary experience of irritation. But then we begin to see there's so many other factors that play in. The more we understand these different factors, the more we actually begin to see that this experience of irritation, in fact, is less strong when we understand the many different conditions that are there. If we understand what's happening with the other person, if we understand that we are conditioned by particular factors, we actually are less prone to be held by this immediate reaction. And that, as sort of uninteresting as this might sound, this is actually where we identify ego, and where we also could begin to identify where we could actually get out of that thing. And it's nothing about us being bad or about the other person being bad. It's just understanding the conditions that are taking place in the situation. And that's why in the Abhidharma, we undertake this study of actually how we're functioning in relation to the experiences we have. But as we're discussing this, we're continually coming back to what's happening with us right here, right now. Now, we're going to be looking at how ego operates in terms of just the experiences that we have, in terms of things we hope to have and things we worry about not having. So we are operating or looking at this thing we call ego, which actually in the English language, ego sounds as if it's something solid. But really, what is implicit in the Buddhist understanding is that it's really just something that we attribute solidity. The Tibetan word is dagdrin, which means holding on to something as if it held some absolute, or as if it held some self. And we're just fixating on what in fact is just continually fluid, but we're fixating on it. It's a bit like, well, we sometimes compare the mind to a crystal, where if you put a crystal on a blue surface, it goes blue. If it's a red surface, it becomes red. And what we're doing, while this mind actually intrinsically is just continually changing on the basis of causes and conditions, we're looking at things, we're hearing things, we're thinking things, feeling things. It's always changing. What we then do is actually we fixate. This happened, and we fixate on it. Sometimes we're thinking of something, and then we just think about the positive aspects, and then somebody thinking, oh, you see everything in such rose-colored glasses. Or somebody might think of things and think of it only from the negative side. And so we can see how we fixate on different aspects. But the reality is there actually is no real solid phenomenon that is taking place. It's us who are, while I'm looking at the wall, that I'm fixating on it in the sense of I like it, I don't like it. Now, this, from the Buddhist perspective, is really just understanding the conditions that contribute to us becoming a bit uptight about our experience. But we do refer to this as ego because it is this slightly ugly thing that we contend with, both on a personal level and also in our dealing with the world. And in his presentation of the Buddhist teaching, Chogyam Trungpa, he very often refers to ego. And just the other day, I came across this little quote from Chogyam Trungpa, which gives some understanding of what we're talking about. This particularly is about ego's sense of time, and it's juxtaposed to when we're not caught up in time. So he says, and this is really just because we're sort of honing in on this dimension of understanding what we're talking about as being ego, this fixation. So he says, in the ordinary sense of ego, there's very little understanding of time. Ego's understanding of time is purely based on desire, what you would like to see, what you would like to develop. It's sort of wishful in terms of ego. It seems that space and time are very solid. So this thing everybody identifies with is like, if we're hungry, then and there's a long time, it's a few hours until mealtime, then we actually might think time goes really slowly. And we're really just experiencing time in terms of how we personally undergo the experience. So ego is very much, the time that we experience is very much related to me. So that's a very good place of actually identifying how ego operates. It operates very much in terms of seeing time and experiencing time as in various ways. So if we're having a great time, then time runs very quickly. So this is really just a beautiful example of how the reality that we're going through actually is filtered through this self-centering. It's really just to sort of begin to become aware of it. Now, this stands in contrast to the vipassana, or the wisdom. And that is, of course, what we cultivate in meditation, and that's what we're continually, you could say, trying to penetrate to and get at. And understand and experience in the Buddhist teaching. It's the opening up to a dimension that's not centered on a self, but rather beyond the self. And that's not because self is bad, but it's simply just because in our ignorance we fixate on things in a particular way. But it seems very real. So when we begin to free ourselves of that, and that's where Trungpa Rinpoche says, in terms of awake experience, the time concept is very loose. In other words, in terms of ego, there's only one center and the radiation from it, meaning we're the center of the world. In terms of beyond ego, center is everywhere and radiation is everywhere. It's not one center, but it's all pervading. And that's where when on the path, when we're less fixated on self, then we actually become aware of, we were just talking about actually to become aware of the space that we're in. When we're very fixated on self, we might walk into a really elegant place and we might sort of just sit down on the coffee table and sort of knock over the coffee cup or something like that, just because we're simply not really sensitive to the space that we're in. But yes, it's shocking, but that does happen. So these kind of just, you could say, expressions of lack of awareness is not that anybody's bad, but it's really just because we're caught up in this self-centered perspective. The moment that we have a wider perspective, then actually we're very attentive to not just the space, but also the others. We're very much seeing the world in terms of our relationship with the others, not just in terms of me versus the world, but rather there's sort of an embracing the world. So this is me just interpreting Trungpa, but I kind of like this little quotation here from Trungpa Rinpoche, just because it sort of identifies what we're looking at in terms of the Abhidharma course. So presently, again, with Abhidharma, then we are essentially beginning to look at how does this reality, how does it actually operate? And we've been for some time looking at essentially the faculty, like the eye, the object, like form, the wall, and then what is generated in my mind when this is white wall. In fact, over there, we just have some stuff, some particles and some, you could say, some density of particles and phenomena and elements and so on, but I label it wall. Maybe I might be a mouse and I'll see this in terms of a potential home and so on. But so the visual perception that I have is generated within my consciousness. So this we all experience. I, the object, the image generated. Yeah? Any questions about this? Yes?
I was just wondering, the black and white dog downstairs, could it have an ego? Because when I was coming in, he immediately rolled over and wanted to be petted.
Yeah.
He really insisted, like there was a tangible desire in him or her.
Yeah.
Wanted the pet.
Yes. So that's how we all operate. And that's actually what we're going to look at now. Yes. The question is, a dog wanting to be patted, does it have an ego? We could possibly sort of conclude that there might be an ego involved there. So yes, we're going to look at now this. We've looked at these three components, but I was curious: is there anything difficult in this? The faculty that we have, I, the object, and the consciousness generated. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's not that difficult. Yeah, good. And so we have five senses. Yeah. So that they all have objects, and they all generate consciousness. They all generate this sort of experience. Yeah. So that's essentially what we've been looking at. It's not that hard, really, but there's one more that in the Buddhist teaching we include as a faculty, and that's the mind. That's because we all experience with the mind. We know what's happening in the mind. For example, I might think of Sydney, or I might think of Canberra. I might think of, Brisbane, And I can actually, in my mind, I can think of maybe the bridge or the river in Brisbane or whatever, and that's taking place on a real level. There's a place where this is experienced. It's in the mind, and it's generating, you know, a sense of the river, you know, South Bank, ice cream, or good food, or you know, a sort of going for a dip in the pools there, whatever. So we have this a sixth sense, which is nothing mysterious. It's really just that we have the mind and the content of the mind, and also the consciousness that's generated in relation to the mind. Yeah.
So is the ego then operating through all the different perceptions, through all different consciousnesses?
Yeah, well, the thing is, what we are really doing is dismantling the whole notion of ego. We're beginning to see what we normally operate with in terms of like and dislike, in fact, is made up of all these different factors. So when I, for example, think, the pools in South Bank in Brisbane, there I'm thinking, you know, a bit like Andrew was talking about the dog that likes to be patted, then I like on a hot day to sort of wallow a bit in the pool, right? So that's where you can say it generates this sense of, I like this. So continually, there's a sense of self-centering that comes back to. When we begin to understand this a bit further, then we just understand that's just an image that's generated in the mind on the basis of a number of conditions. And here, we're just thinking the mind, memory of Brisbane, the image of the pools, and then the sense of, I love this, you know? So it's really just breaking down, you could say it is ego, but it's breaking down the components of experience. And the objective is the more we break these components down, the less we're held by it. That's all we're doing.
The likes and dislikes flow through all the different consciousnesses. They're not separate as something other than those 6 integrational functions.
Exactly, yeah. They do, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're always hijacked by memory of what was good and bad in the past. So be able to look freshly at something that's because of the hijacking.
Yeah.
And how to sort of offset that.
Yeah, so we're very often, so the question is, we're hijacked by memories of the past. And you see, that's a very good word, hijacked, because what really happens is that we have a thought that comes up in the present moment, and then on the basis of then our particular feeling, let's say we haven't had enough to eat, and then a memory of the past all of a sudden becomes a very dark memory. But then we might be outside in the open, and the flowers are smelling sweet and so on. We think of something in the past, and rather than thinking of something as something dark, then we actually think of it as something, you know, workable, pleasant, right? So the memory is taking place in the present moment, isn't it? So that's where we very often would say, for example, the past was like that. Then when we begin to analyze, then we begin to understand that the past is actually made up of a number of conditions. The mind that's generating the thought, and the particular present moment that's coloring that experience of the memory.
So are you saying, Jakob, we're not actually in the moment at all?
That's kind of also Trungpa Rinpoche's point there before. We're very much sort of just operating from ego's perspective. And well, that's maybe different. But yes, you're right. Well, the thing is, we actually are in the moment. But the thing is, we think that the past is real. But in fact, the past is just being constructed in the present moment.
So, hang on, I just want to get this clear. So, in the moment, I get that we're physically there, and we're having these memories that are colouring whatever the experience is right here. So,
Yeah.
even though we're physically here,
yeah,
is it that we're not actually here, are we?
Well, we actually are here. We actually are here, aren't we?
Well, yeah, I guess, but the other experience is somewhere else, isn't it?
Well, it's actually taking place right now. So, for example, if right now I say breakfast, then you might think of a lovely breakfast you had this morning. But that's taking place right now, isn't it?
Yeah, it is something tricky, but I can't catch it. I can't figure out what it is.
But in a way,
I get it. Like
yeah.
Wherever the breakfast is.
Yeah.
And it's happening right in this moment. But isn't that colouring, isn't that hijacking, isn't that obscuring what's actually present?
Yes, that's right. That's right. But the point is that we're creating the memory of the past right now. Let's say you're hungry, and then you think of that beautiful breakfast you had this morning. Then the experience of that breakfast, actually, the thought of the breakfast is actually like, "Roof, that was really wonderful," and it feels even better. Whereas if you're quite full, then just thinking of the breakfast you had this morning in the present moment is actually quite a neutral feeling. Oh yeah, I had this. So it's very matter of fact. All we're really doing here is just trying to see that these experiences that we have, that we label good and bad and so on, they're actually made up of so many different components. And it's really just understanding the complexity that enables us to begin to be less caught by it.
So would it be true to say then that what we actually want right now is to be less caught by those experiences?
Yes.
We want to grab something, so we're going to end up less caught by it.
Yes.
So that's what we want right now.
That would make our life easier. And that's where the Buddha identified we could make our life miserable and we could make it happy. So just like a doctor would say, you want to be healthy, then the Buddha also say you'd want to have a happier life rather than a difficult life.
So is it typically more difficult to really catch what is it that I actually want right now as I'm sitting here?
Yes, and that actually defines the condition of us people, really, that even though we want to be happy, we very often pursue things that make us not so happy. So that's where we're a bit confused. So, we'd want to be happy persons, but very often we are approaching it in a way of self-centering or self-serving and so forth, and being very rigid about good and bad and what we want and so on. And it actually sabotages our own happiness.
But that's because other people don't understand us. That's their problem.
Well, we could say it's the other people, but we're the ones who end up experiencing the happiness and the suffering. So at the end of the day, it's really about us. We can't really blame it on anybody else.
So it's really about our creation, right? Distinguished or undistinguished.
Yes.
We're the source of it, right?
Yeah. Yes. So, we could put a lot of blame on the other people, but at the end of the day, that's really putting the power over in the other camp.
I was just thinking about this dog. It was really just so powerfully demanding the pet.
Yes, yes.
It was uncompromising about it.
Oh dear.
And shameless.
Oh yes. But you must probably, maybe he recognizes you're a good petter. So he was saying, oh, there comes Andrew. He gives a nice pat. Please, Andrew, pet me.
Actually, it was deeper than that. I realized that I am like that dog myself.
There you go. Yes, we are. We are rather. Okay, so in fact, this comes right down to what we're discussing here. Let me just see if there's probably some questions out here. So without the senses, no consciousness. In some way, yes. Generally, consciousness is generated on the basis of subject and object. Thought Buddhism refutes that ego exists, or is that talking ultimate? Yes, that is talking ultimate. So of course, the point is that as long as we're caught in this fixating on these various, or rather fixating on the experience of like and dislike, good and bad, there's a very strong sense of me in the relation to my world. And that's where we become rigid. I am having a good time. I am having a bad time. And it really consolidates this sense of I. So we need to acknowledge that there is this experience of pain. Now, what we do with the teaching is that we begin to see that, in fact, all these conditions that constitute our experience of good and bad are made up of different conditions. And that's where we become less held by them. So in the Dharma, or rather, if we analyze, we'll see there actually is no ego. But on the basis of attributing solidity to this experience and the object and so forth, then we have this tightness around good and bad. Something good is happening to me, something bad is happening to me. And the more that becomes tight, the more we actually have less fun. The more we relax that, the easier our relationship with the world is. And for us to relax that, we shouldn't just be told you should relax it, but we can actually see there's not really anything in the what's going on that is solid. So for example, I might think of the breakfast, and I think must have breakfast, but if I begin to think, oh, it's on the basis of, you know, the company that was there this morning, it's on the basis that I'm tired, it's on the basis that I'm hungry, then we begin to actually see it's just a number of conditions and thoughts that are generating this image. In terms of what to adopt and what to abandon, though, there are certain environments, even certain company, that isn't ideal for creating the causes and conditions for our sense of well-being. And what colors us is also dependent on our karma. So wouldn't we all need different conditions for our sanity? How is that rigid? That's being realistic. So that's true. That is so true. But for example, presently we have the freedom of actually analyzing what's going on. So right now we have ideal conditions. So that's where we are appreciating that we have particular conditions that are ideal for beginning to extract ourselves from what we normally get caught up in. So that's where we appreciate the present conditions. So that is just being, you could say, humbly acknowledging that we're dependent on these conditions. But when we're talking about rigidity, that is the problem. So we're talking about here is actually getting to the bottom of what causes this rigidity. The rigidity takes place when we say it's just one essential thing, good, bad. That's the rigidity. And when we analyze things, you know, we'll meet somebody who's really upset about something. We meet a friend. The friend says, oh, I was just talking to so-and-so, and I feel so upset because this person was rude. And then we say, well, what do you think is happening with the other person? Then we're interjecting analysis, right? And then we decide, oh, well, the person just maybe has gone through some painful moment in their life, and they have a diagnosis with an illness, and et cetera, et cetera. And when we begin to see the complexity, and maybe also the conversation took place at a time where there wasn't much time, and so on, you know, maybe the person was going out of the shop and you were coming into the shop, and you just sort of make this sort of connection and say, oh, that was a rude encounter, but maybe just because the person was running late or something like that. So the moment that we interject analysis, then we begin to dissolve this rigidity or this solidity around things. So that's where it helps. That's where this analysis actually helps us. So that's where the vipassana that is the objective of the Buddhist teaching is not something about being good or bad. It's about understanding what's taking place. So it's like if, for example, we have responsibility, if we have responsibility for children, you know, and somebody might say, oh, that's a rude child. Because, you know, the child is maybe teething, you know, or maybe the child is going through difficulties, and we as the caregiver, we know what the child is undergoing. So we have this aerial perspective. So the point here really is just to begin to interject this analytical perspective. And that's what we're doing with this data analysis and so on. So then there's a question here. The word ego immediately generates the idea of enemy, bad person, etc. Is labeling itself just the same? To me, it is more open, vast, and so easier to work with. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same thing, just coming back to identifying what we can call it self, we can call it ego. It's the same thing. Yeah. But let's look at how this for example, experience this plays out. So for us to understand ego, and for the whole entire path really is not about some high philosophical project with all sorts of things that need to be learned. It's about what's immediate. And that's where the humble recognition of what really this self undergoes. That's really the working material. We actually need to come back to where we are, what we're experiencing. And that's where we can see there's there's an issue here, which is what we call this self and the rigidity and the suffering around the self. So that's where we presently are looking at how this plays out. So here, then, Steven, he writes, fear of pain. This actually is all summed up in what we call the 8 worldly dharmas. And so the practitioner who practices is intending to break through these 8 worldly dharmas. And they essentially all come down to hope and fear, which is what we all have, hope and fear. And that's where you could say the ego is premised on this continual experience of hope and fear. So that's where, this is where we get stuck. So we could say, oh, it's normal to have hope and fear. Yes, but that's why we suffer. So we're addressing a universal condition. And that's where, for us to not have this as an abstract philosophical discussion, we need to come right down to something that we can immediately relate to. And something that we all can immediately relate to is fear of pain. So right now, we're not talking about something spiritual or abstract or anything. We're talking about the most immediate thing there that we actually have, which is fear of pain. There you go. So from the moment we get up in the morning until we go to bed at night, we fear pain, physical or mental. We make elaborate plans to avoid or at least delay any situation that is physically or mentally painful. The first of the 8 is fear of pain. So essentially we have 4 that have to do with fear and 4 that have to do with hope. So this is a very immediate experience that we have. So we can all, do we all have fear of pain? I guess so. I don't know. Yeah? Good.
Doesn't that give you ammunition to be able to avoid or to move?
Yes, exactly. So that is where the self or the ego operates from, moving away or moving towards. So that's on the basis of fear of pain is where we want to move away. Fear of loss. We also fear and make plans to avoid any loss. We fear losing anything that we regard as ours. We plan to not lose, or we fear that we're going to lose. So the first is pain, the second is loss. Fear of blame. We also fear being criticized by others, being shamed, being told that we did not do a good job or that we didn't do it correctly. We fear this and we avoid being judged in the way if we can. We'll develop a way of being clever or engage in a bit of lying, but maybe for a good reason. So we say, in order to not be the target. We avoid situations of responsibility in this way. This is the third pattern, fear of being blamed. And then the fourth, fear of bad reputation. The fourth is fear. The fourth form of fear is fear of being remembered or talked about with lack of respect. It is the fear that the gossip about us will not go the way we want the gossip to go. This is the fear of having a bad reputation. So, fear of pain, of loss, of being shamed directly, and a fear of bad reputation are the 4 ways in which our tightness, our wanting to control, flows with respect to trying to avoid. So this is all the first 4, what we call the 8 worldly dharmas. This is how we ordinary sentient beings operate. So let's just see if there's a question here. So yes, Elizabeth Mathis Namdal says we should make our egos really big. Exactly, yes. But we need to first understand what does ego look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? And that's where this analysis of how ego operates in terms of hope and fear is where we can begin to identify it. So this is where we can see how this sense is so deep within us. So then there's the hope for pleasure. We can guess what the other 4 are, which is of course the exact opposite. He says, but it's good to remember that from the moment we wake up in the morning until we go to bed at night, we're hoping for pleasurable situations, physically and mentally. Let's say you come to meditate here and then the dog barks and you think, oh, I can't meditate if the dog is barking. But we could also have the mind that says the dog is barking and we could be easygoing. So that's where we can see ego. This is the one that would say, I don't like the dog is barking. But then absence of ego is actually that, yeah, the dog is barking and should be allowed to put that bark. You could think maybe the dog is protecting us. Maybe somebody is arriving that, that we are being notified that somebody's coming. There's a lot of great things about dogs barking. So it all stands and falls with how do we choose to perceive the particular situation. But if there's this tightness involved, oh, I don't want the dog to bark, it should be quiet, I'm meditating, then we're in conflict with reality. And that is what ego is. It's this conflict with reality. We're going to be undergoing all sorts of experiences. The beauty of the sage and the beauty of, you could say, the dimension that we're proposing is that you could be open to reality as it is. This doesn't mean that if the Dalai Lama gets a toothache, he's just going to sit there and not do something about it. Or if there's a dog that's howling out on the street, he's not going to feed it. But it just means that there's not this, what essentially tightness that we're talking about, this like and dislike. And the problem with our likes and dislikes is that we end up censoring the world. We never actually live because we're always involved in pushing some things away and trying to hold on to others. But the thing is, we can't push things away because there's all sorts of things that we might not have ordered, which is just the nature of reality. And we can't hold on to pleasurable circumstances. That's something we've experienced as we've gone through life. So that's where we can say the pebble in the shoe in terms of our existence is this dimension of tightness, this thing that we call ego.
Would it be then true to say that we can't push it away and we can't hold on to it, then we live in our life is just a life of disappointment? Like our lives is what we call life is just disappointment because we can't get what we want and we can't push away what we don't want. So if we can't do that, we can't. That's terrible.
That's right. That's right. That's from the point of view of ego, life is terrible. So that's the thing. Yes. So from the ego's point of view, we're always going to be losing what we want and being disappointed by losing what we want, and also sort of how do you say, miserable because of all the unwanted things. So that's the Buddha's diagnosis, which is that we are suffering. That's why Buddha, as the doctor, is trying to get to the bottom of this. Yes, Paul?
So ego is always used in a negative sense.
Well, that's the problem with ego. But yeah, ego is used in a dirty sense. But you see,
isn't it our relationship, subject-object, that's the issue?
Yes.
Not
very good. Yeah, that's a very good comment. That ego is a dirty word, and that's also my point earlier on. It's the Tibetan word is actually fixating on things as solid, and that's what you're saying here. The problem lies in the subject-object fixation or the subject-object relationship. So that's right. So instead of having an open relationship to the world, we're involved in this fixating in terms of what we want, and that's where the whole problem lies. So in fact, while ego sounds as if there's somebody who's bad, in fact, you're right. This is just a situation of, you could say, cognitive dysfunction. So all we're really are diagnosing is there's something that's gone wrong. We've gotten unnecessarily uptight. And this is also where compassion comes from, because that's where we also begin to understand the predicament that everybody in the world goes through. We're profoundly attached to things, and we're profoundly averse to other things. And so everybody in this world is suffering from this. So the project here is not trying to construct some sort of nirvanic vision of what should or should not be, but it comes from a place of understanding how much suffering there is in the world. So the Bodhisattva's perspective is trying to understand what is it that drives all this suffering that we have. So we're trying to get to the bottom of what really, you could say, propels our whole situation of suffering. So there's never a place in the Buddhist teaching where we're going for something high, spiritual, beautiful. It's actually getting down and dirty with what we as individuals are going through. And that's where the Bodhisattva is never sort of above it all. The Bodhisattva is in there. And that's where the study here, like when we come to the Buddhist teaching, we could say the Buddha could have just talked about nirvana and light and love, but instead the Buddha is talking about where does our suffering come from? Where does it originate? Where does that subjectivity that is tortured and pained actually originate? So it's trying to get to the bottom of this. And this is also where we talk about the Buddhist path, because we never ever assumed that you could just sort of get a mantra or something that immediately sort of, oh yeah, cool, just like these sort of little fridge magnet slogans that sort of, like what it says, whatever, just let it go or whatever, these kind of dreadful cliches that are almost insulting, because you think that, you could have a spiritual sort of relief just by having a fridge magnet that has some wise word. But the implication of the Buddhist path is this is actually difficult. This requires path. And that's why within the science of Buddhism, there's never ever an assumption that you go to the temple and the teacher gives you a mantra or some koan and then you walk out and everything's hunky-dory. It requires work. It requires actually dealing with what we experience as the beginning point. And that's where we need to actually go down and sort of, you could say, do the rude work of understanding where exactly does our pain originate. So we're going to have to talk about ego. We're going to identify it. And of course, ego is not something fixed. There's sometimes where ego is really very relaxed. If we don't have too much invested, then we're quite relaxed. We might get our coffee served with a bit of coffee spilt in the saucer, and that's kind of all right. But then we might have people who get really uptight about this. Take the coffee back. I don't want a coffee with with spilt or whatever. So we can see there's places where tightness is very little, but then there's the big issues. Here we're talking very benign things, but we talk about the really big issues of the human existence, which Buddha taught as birth, old age, sickness, and death. This is not easy. So there's never ever sort of a place where we can just say, oh yeah, this is nice, meditation, Om, Hari Om, whatever, Om Mani Padme Hum, whatever, that we could just wish it away. This is actually dealing with what is difficult. So that's why we're actually using time to go into this analysis. Just like if you're studying medicine, you're going to study pharmacology. So that's where there's a lot of analysis that goes into understanding this. Same with this also, we study sort of the various factors of what we're experiencing.
I was just wondering that nevertheless, is there a kind of really subtle implication in the whole teaching that there is a way out?
Yes.
So what if there's a mistake? What if there's no way out?
Well, luckily from the time of the Buddha down to the present day, there's actually been many who have found the way out. And even us, this is not just speculation, but we actually have this. Let's say that going back to maybe a benign issue, like somebody taking a parking space or whatever. But when I remember one of my teachers once, somebody asked, "Hey, so what's nirvana like? What is it like when we're out?" So the question is there a way out? And how do we know that there's a way out? Could there be a mistake? And so, yes, the Buddha could have been mistaken, right? But the thing is, from the time of the Buddha down to the present day, we really have, you could say, 2,500 years of individuals confirming what the Buddha found. So this is not just subscribing to the dogma, but really the discovery. But that, you might say, oh, well, the Dalai Lama discovered it, but I haven't. But that's not true, because we actually can individually experience that. For example, we could become angry. And when we become angry, we could pursue it. And we can see the pain that comes out of that. I can look back at my life and I can see the mistakes I made, anger or whatever it might be. And I can also see the times where I did something smart, where I maybe was patient. Somebody did wrong, but instead of getting angry, I was patient. I understood that there may be what the other person was going through. So instead of just seeing it from my perspective, I was able to see it from the other's perspective. And that's where I could actually identify the experience, that this is right. So we're talking about something that we can empirically verify. Why we, for example, really appreciate natural science is because you know, like somebody says, you go to the top of Mount Everest and they say water boils at 68 degrees there. Yeah. Now that I could actually go there. I'm probably not going to do it, but I can go and verify that. And that's why we talk about verifiable science. So somebody says, you know, there's a cow in the paddock, and I can go and verify that. It's not like something that is just a sort of mystical truth. So why we accept something as true is because we can verify it on the basis of our own experience. So when we are looking at this here, for example, and we begin to see that if we see the components of why we might have a reaction, then we're less prone to be held by this particular reaction. And this we can verify for ourselves. So what we have there is actually a chart of something we can apply in terms of our immediate experience.
So there's hope. There is hope.
So there's hope. Very much. There's hope of freedom.
But I was just wondering, in the name of inquiry and exploration.
Yeah.
What if I consider that? Well, what if I look at the other side, like the yin yang? What if the big man was mistaken? What if there's no way out? What if this is it? This is it.
That's very good. So the question comes back, but still, what if the Buddha was wrong? And that's where the Buddha, he famously said, you should never accept what I say out of respect. So in the Buddhist teaching, we don't respect the Buddha. We give him the benefit of the doubt. He might be right. So if the Buddha says there's a cow in the paddock, the Buddha says, don't trust me. He says, go and check if there's a cow in the paddock. So in the Buddhist teaching, you are encouraged actually to doubt and verify and check. You know, why we accept science is because we say it's falsifiable. We can actually go in and see whether science is right or wrong. Now, if somebody says, you know, the whole world was created in 7 days, then we can't really do much. That's like, okay, people say that. We can't really falsify that or verify it. It's just okay, that's what you believe. But this is different. So if you say that that water boils at a certain temperature, you know, we generally say water boils at 99 degrees or something like that, not exactly 100. We can verify that. So if we're looking at anger, and does anger create suffering or not, we can verify that. So that's where the science that we're talking about here is verifiable. So it doesn't really matter if the Buddha was right or wrong. We can actually test the hypothesis. So it's a very important question that you ask.
Well,
because
that's why it's so important. That's why it's so interesting, because when I consider that maybe there's no way out, how do I feel a real aversion to that idea. I really don't like that idea I really want to believe that there's a way.
Well, you can verify it.
I really hope.
No, not hope. Check. So that's where we say, have a look. The Buddha doesn't say hope for something in the future. The Buddha says, the moment that there's the experience of anger, see how you can work with it. So somebody might say, there's good fishing down at Brunswick Heads. So you go down, you verify. You don't say, oh, I hope there might be good fishing down in Brunswick Heads. You can actually go down and verify whether or not there is good fishing. So that's where we're not really working with hope in that sense. We're identifying hope as part of the neurosis of self. But as far as the objective of the path, which is understanding how our mind works, we have to verify. So I'm very glad for this discussion, because it's really important. We're not operating with hope. We're operating with what can be verified. And unfortunately, spirituality is so often talking about something that is in the future and something distant, that there's hope. But certainly in the Buddhist teaching, we don't really endorse that, because that would be very speculative and not very helpful. So the entire premise of the Buddhist teaching is that it's something that we can verify in terms of our experience. Okay, we're gonna have to leave it at that. You're gonna have to think about that and see if you accept it. If not, come back.
I think so.
Huh? Okay. So let's just
read the teachers all about biography of literature downstairs. It's like amazing library of accomplished the result. Like, it's
Yeah.
inspiring to read like the writing.
So there's a question here. The 8 worldly dharmas also being called the 8 worldly winds. Is that right? Yes, that's right. If you read Milarepa's life story, he talked about Mappa is talking to Milarepa, who's having a hard time one day, and he says, my son, are the 8 worldly winds blowing in your cave? So that's right. So so then let's just see here. Last night, local screening of a lovely movie at the Pictures with the subtle DJKR teaching in our scene. The movie Lunana, a yak in the classroom, will reach the northern rivers with the traveling film festival for screening at the Lismore Cinema Saturday, the 5th of June at 4 p.m. Okay, thank you very much. School Among Glaciers on YouTube was a documentary about the same school a few years ago. Thank you very much. Good. Let's see. I have a few questions. Buddha said that we need not accept, but investigate. But teaching on karma, for example, relies on scriptural authority because there is no way for ordinary beings to verify it. Could you please offer some thoughts on it, please? That's true, but we use what is called inferential logic. That is, for example, right now, I say there's a cow in the paddock, right? Because there was a cow in the paddock an hour ago. I can't actually see it right now. But let's say that the paddock is closed. I could verify, or I could assume, I could infer logically the cow probably is still there. Now, as far as karma goes, we can see that when we, for example, act on an action of negativity, then it begins to sit in our character. Let's say I have a habit of becoming angry when things don't go my way. The more I do that, the more I can see that becomes part of me. So that's why we can say karma is not necessarily that abstract. Of course, we could say the result of that particular pattern, it will result in my dreams. It might also be something that emerges later on. It comes up in my memories later on. And we would say it operates on the basis of a storehouse consciousness. But that storehouse consciousness is not something particularly mystical, because we can see actually that within our experience, the way that we store experiences and have memories, and we lay down particular patterns, we can even talk about hardwiring. That actually is exactly what karma means, namely actions that become patterns. So karma is saying what we can observe. So karma essentially observes action. So cause and effect. Is something that we can observe in the outer world, and we can also observe it on the level of, say, oh, it's in a future. That's true. Presently is not within our experience, but that's also just like if somebody talks about subatomic physics, I actually can't verify it, but I again rely on them. I say, okay, these people at MIT or Stanford or whatever, they know what they're talking about. There is an element of trust. But at the same time, my life experience has also proven me that the science that they're operating with is empirical, is not speculative. So you're right. We would generally say there's 3 kinds of ways that we can validate something. It's through direct observation, inferential logic, and then also, as you're saying, scriptural authority, which also in the modern world actually translates into just trusting the source of our information as being trustworthy. Okay. With my doubt and recognition that the current. Okay. So, okay, maybe this is a personal question, so maybe shoot me an email about that. Okay, it might be tricky to sort of treat that here. Ego is not the enemy; it's our ignorance that is keeping us bound in the cycle of suffering. Exactly. Very good. So ego is not an enemy because actually ego doesn't exist. And ignorance should be understood not in terms of us not being privy to some great secret, but just the fact that we're actually ignoring. So what do we actually do when we're meditating is discontinuing the ordinary practice of ignoring. Normally we're not present. Normally when we're sitting and we don't have anything to do, we sit and we fiddle. You know, we look around, we reach for the remote, we look for another book, and we're never really here. But when we're meditating, we're actually sitting fully present and experiencing our body, experiencing our mind. We discontinue fiddling. We discontinue sort of being distracted by our phone or by our thoughts or by all these things that distract us. So in that sense, the practice of meditation is the perfect antidote for this situation of ignorance. Okay. Okay. We'll conclude at this point. Just gone a little bit over time. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you. We'll just have a 2-minute break, and then we'll continue with the next component of the program, which is instruction and meditation. How are the old knees doing? They're still going?
Do we have any more of the mindfulness in action books?
That's right. We used to actually have them. So the next, so the next section here of the program is really the essential part of the Buddhist path, because this is where we actually move out of the theory and into actual experience. And the practice of meditation is where we begin to actually feel rather than be caught in our thoughts. So we can have all sorts of thoughts. So sometimes we have thoughts that are battling each other. We could say, I would like to hope this, but I fear that. This is what we just talked about in terms of the ego. We're hoping for some things to happen. We're fearing that some things can happen. And meanwhile, reality is actually, you could say, free from any of these projections. Reality exists unconditionally, beyond hope and fear. So the yogi is someone that begins to become accustomed to settling into a complete acceptance of reality beyond hope and fear. And that actually doesn't come from just a moralistic sense that I would like to be beyond hope and fear, which itself is just another thought. And then we could have the opposite, another thought that would say, well, I hope this, or I want this, or want that. Meditation, interestingly, is where we begin to just connect with reality, but without the normal, you could say, vacuous daydreaming and absence. So with the practice of meditation, interestingly, we're connecting with reality where our thoughts are really just one chain of speculations that happen one after the other. And what thoughts typically do is that they stand in relation to me and my agenda. I would like this, I don't want that. So we're very often operating from a self-imprisoned situation of just self-absorption. With the practice of meditation, we actually begin to discontinue our fascination with our thoughts. We're not saying that when you sit down and meditate, we have no thoughts. That's not likely to happen. Could happen, but don't expect it. The reality, however, is that the thoughts are really what we get caught up in, and they always stand in relation to what's happening to me. And so we're not going to stop the thoughts, but what we could do is be present where the thoughts they arise, but we don't do what we ordinarily do, which is cling on to them, fixate on them. So we are having the usual experience that we have, but we do something that is radically different, that we allow ourselves to be present, but without fixating on the thoughts. And that's where the normal drama that's generated between me and the way that I'm relating to the world in terms of my conceptual reactions to the world and this, that, and the other, hope and fear of various kinds, that essentially it's just solidifying and generating the fixation on me, the drama around me. It actually breaks a particular pattern, enables us to see beyond. And that's what where we then say that Vipassana naturally ties in with this dimension that we call, where shamatha, calm abiding, remaining mindful and non-distracted, it ties in with a wider perspective that lies beyond self. So interestingly, the practitioner of meditation becomes less, and this is of course where we would say in the nth degree, we can look at sages. And what's so delightful about a sage is that the sage is very much concerned about the world around. So the sage is someone who's not retreating into their particular little nirvana or their particular little, you say, comfort zone, but is very much present within the world. That's what makes the Dalai Lama wonderful. If the Dalai Lama just sat on the throne, pontificated, and say, I'm incredibly wise, look at me, then he would just be yet another narcissistic guru, which would be very unappealing. What's beautiful about the Dalai Lama is the Dalai Lama's care. And also, the Dalai Lama's actually power to communicate this to others, because there's a lot of really lovely people, but they don't really get the message out. What's so wonderful about the Dalai Lama is that there's actually, and we would say actually that's on the basis of the Dalai Lama's bodhisattva prayers, that the Dalai Lama actually has an impact in the world. So that's where not just does the Dalai Lama have the kindness and the aspiration, but the Dalai Lama also has what we call the skillful means to actually effectively influence the discourse and effectively have an impact in the world. But the bottom line is, what we would like about the Dalai Lama is not that he's some great charismatic leader of sorts, but that there's this profound kindness that has to do with a deep quality of humanity, of goodness, that we resonate with. So that has nothing really to do with the Dalai Lama has read a lot. It doesn't have to do with the Dalai Lama maybe levitates, or the Dalai Lama doesn't sleep, or the Dalai Lama doesn't eat, or whatever it might be, that we could sort of, in a comic book version of what spirituality is, maybe think that would be far out. What really touches us with the Dalai Lama is that this genuineness, the humanity. And that's what we admire in the Dalai Lama, it's what we admire in other people. That's what we would like to do. So in that sense, the practice of meditation is never ever about retreating away from the world, but actually it is about connecting with that deep dimension of genuine humanity. And that is where the beauty of the sage and the beauty of the path is really, that it's where it's going is that it takes us out of this ordinary self-absorption and breaks this ordinary duality, but where we would say this and that, self and other. So with the practice of meditation, this is what we're doing. This has nothing to do with wishful thinking. This has nothing to do with that we could go into a particular state. This has to do with something that unconditionally is about breaking out of our normal absence and our normal fascination with our thinking, and actually begin to connect with something that is unconditionally naked, present, and not sort of entangled with our particular projections, our hopes and fears. So practically speaking then, the practices of meditation, or the two aspects of meditation that we generally operate with, is what we call shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha is the practice of being present, not distracted. And that is where we do something that's not easy, because we are generally we might not acknowledge it. It might even be so much part of us we don't even know, but we actually are very fascinated by our thinking. And we actually never stop thinking. It's always there, like an undertow. And we might think, oh, well, then isn't the solution then to not think? No, that's not the issue. The issue lies in not being distracted, not being seduced by the thoughts. And what is interesting, and we can see that, I'm sure everyone can see that, being lost in thought is when we're simply just not here. We're just thinking. And we might not notice it ourselves, but others will. And we also notice it in others. This sort of like, we see people who are lost in thought. And that's not bad. There's nothing bad they're doing, but we know that they're not really here. So if we're with some friends, we might just go over and say, hello, planet Earth calling, welcome back, and so on. And they snap out of it. That's not because the thoughts, we could say they're stopped. It's not really, the issue is not really the thoughts. It's that they're lost in their fascination with thoughts. That's distraction. Yeah? So?
Sorry. I think that there are different types of dispositions in people as well. Like, think of someone like so-called more extroverted, and they don't seem lost in their own mind so much, but they still might be like blended to their own thinking styles, even though they're completely more in an outward way.
Yeah, that's right. We can be lost in thought. We can also be lost in the object. So you could say the extrovert is more perhaps possibly engaged in visual, audible, whatever perceptions. So there's various ways. But the bottom line is this condition of distraction. And that's where we're simply not here. We as individuals, we are here and yet we're not. And that's where coming back means actually discontinuing this distracted, lost condition. And that's what we mean with mindfulness. So mindfulness is this practice that is apparently easy, but not easy at all. Because again, we're fidgety. When we sit down, we reach for the remote, we reach for our phone, we reach for a book. We're like little monkeys. So we fidget. We don't actually sit properly. So with all respects to monkeys, of course, but you know, unfortunately, there's just this condition of not really sort of being properly inhabiting our own dignity and our own existence. So shamatha is creating the conditions where we could have this presence. So we call it mindfulness, and we could also talk about that as juxtaposed to or the opposite of mindlessness. So mindlessness also we are familiar with. So if we know what mindlessness is, we probably know what mindfulness is implicitly. So shamatha is the practice of being present, and we do that on the basis of having an object of focus. So we have something that we come back to. It can be different things. Some people, you know, like in the yoga world, you sometimes have this practice of sitting looking at a candle. Sometimes you'll look at a stone or a flower. In this context, and in many Buddhist traditions, we simply use the breath. And the value of the breath is that it doesn't have concepts. Because otherwise we might sit and meditate, but we're just sitting thinking one thing after the other. We might have virtuous thoughts, so that's wonderful if we have that. But essentially, we're still held by the conceptual mind. We're still distracted. We're not really connecting with being present. And so as much as it's great to have virtuous thoughts and good thoughts and so on, it's still conditioned. So the value of meditation lies in that we begin to actually have an unconditional confidence in being properly present. The objective of calm abiding is that we actually connect with the reality that we're in, with the present moment. Very briefly, it just means not being distracted, being properly present. Now, like I said, we do this on the basis of the coming back to an object that brings us back. Otherwise, we're drifting. Having something to come back to is like an anchor. So we come back to this object. So practically speaking, when we're practicing meditation, what we do is that we sit straight, and the practice of meditation very often is sort of defined in terms of a particular posture. Of course, it doesn't really ultimately depend on the posture, but it's just with sitting in a posture where we're, you could say, wholeheartedly present, sitting straight, and so on, actually enables us to be the best we could be physically. And that also allows then for the mind to be properly present. So we would say if the nadis are straight, the prana is straight. If the prana is straight, the bindu is straight, which means the mind is straight in the sense of just being as best it could be. So we sit, and then also we then focus on we bring our attention back to the object of mindfulness, in this case the breath. And particularly in the Mahayana, we very much come back to the out-breath. We're very much focused on the out-breath, because the out-breath is what actually is the vehicle for breaking down this duality between self and other. It's us breaking down the duality between, you say, the awareness and space. So the out-breath is particularly helpful. Of course, we breathe in again, but we don't really pay that much attention to it. And again, we breathe out. And this is where we begin to have a sense of, say, larger involvement that goes beyond just, you say, ourselves. So it's partly creates the condition really for this wider perspective. So in that sense, the focus, as the first aspect is the posture, the second aspect is awareness of the out-breath as it exits from our nostrils, fuses with space, and then just a gap as the in-breath happens, and again, awareness of the out-breath. So this is what we do. Something that Trungpa Rinpoche very often emphasizes is that he says, please don't try to second guess this. When you're meditating, please do this. We could say, oh yeah, the guy just gave us all these meditation instructions, now I'm going to do my own thing. It's very much true. There's a lot of value in this method, which lies in a great skill of actually exactly how to handle our psychology, our mind. So this preciseness is very, very valuable. Otherwise, meditation can become something incredibly vague and sort of a homemade sort of practice of just sitting and just sort of like just feeling good or whatever, you know. It's very precise, this method. And then the third aspect has to do with our thoughts, where we ordinarily tag along with our thoughts. And that again is where we sort of retreat into a rather self-involved space where we essentially are not really properly present. The interesting thing about meditation is that we're connecting with reality. We're connecting with beyond ourselves. We're breaking this shell of self-absorption, and that also is breaking the you could say the barrier between self and other. We become more present, and implicitly the like I was saying before, what's nice about the Dalai Lama is that the Dalai Lama is not sitting in some nirvanic transcendental zone. The Dalai Lama is very present, and what we enjoy about other people is when their presence, and our presence are required. Ladies and gentlemen, we are required in this world. We, we have things to do. There are people who need us. So we can't, it's not only that we shouldn't be self-absorbed, it's that we actually aren't. We are actually situated within a world. We can't actually retreat. So it's already a given. But what makes us retreat and what sets up the barrier is our fascination with our thinking and being lost in thought. And implicitly with that, then the whole dynamic of this perpetuating the action and reaction with the phenomenal experiences of hope and fear, like and dislike, that consolidates this solidity of the sense of I, and essentially this barrier between self and other. We soften this with this lack of fascination with our thinking. So the last method, the first being the posture, the second is mindfulness of breath, the last is the awareness of the thoughts and yet not tagging along with them. So not being distracted is not just that we're present in the sense of being incredibly focused, but it's also that the grip that our fascination with our thoughts normally has falls away, and we begin to have a little bit of wiggle room in which we know what we're thinking, but we're not defined by it, we're not held by it, we're not controlled by it. The thing is, paradoxically, we're quite submissive to our thoughts. We're quite submissive to these sort of impulses that arise in the mental states. And we are generally sort of, you say, not victims, and very often surprisingly gullible in terms of just subscribing to the solidity of our thinking. And this is where we introduce this dimension of openness. It doesn't mean that we're demonizing the thoughts, but we're allowing the thoughts to arise without necessarily fixating on them. Like I said before, we can place a crystal on a surface that has a particular color, and the crystal will take on the color, but the crystal is actually not changing in terms of becoming yellow or blue or red. And likewise, we might have thoughts that arise in the mind, but they're actually not, and they will, if we fixate on them, then we would say, oh, my mind is this particular way. But what we're doing with meditation is actually allow the colors to be there without fixating on them. So we would be aware of what arises in the mind, just like we would be aware of clouds that are present in the sky, and yet not holding on to them. The sky doesn't think, I like those clouds. Let me hold on to them. I don't want those clouds. So that's where essentially we are providing this space that is not going into fixating on little clouds, but actually just accommodating this vastness. So, and we can also sometimes say it's a bit like waves on the ocean. We would say on the surface there might be waves, but the depth actually is undisturbed. So that's where us being present enables us to be aware of the thoughts, appreciate that thoughts arise. It's a good thing. Thoughts, you could say it's the spark of intelligence. There's nothing wrong with thoughts. But what we do is we allow the thoughts, but we touch, and then we just let them go. So that's where the practice of meditation is radically different from the rather unconscious, mindless tagging along with the sort of undertow of narratives that we normally are absorbed in. That is where the practice of meditation enables us to have this wider perspective beyond just ourselves. So while it looks like when we're meditating, we're absorbed in ourselves. It's actually the place where we have the vantage points of not being deceived by this undertow of narratives. So the practice of meditation, interestingly, is what takes us out of our head. It takes us out of our ordinary fascination with our thinking. And that's why meditators emerge beautifully. Otherwise, people would go to the mountains of the Himalayas and they'd come back completely weirded out and self-absorbed and impossible, basically. But meditators who meditate properly come back from either 20 minutes of meditation in their living room or back from the caves in the Himalayas, beautiful, open, present. So this is what we'd want to do. The practice of meditation that we do here, we do in conjunction with invoking the Buddha. So hopefully all of you have, please have a copy there of the text. But we start with a liturgy that invokes the presence of the Buddha, which creates really a different atmosphere. So while we ordinarily are caught up in all sorts of thoughts of this and that, invoking the presence of the Buddha then creates a different feeling. We're not invoking the Buddha as a savior, but we're invoking the Buddha as the embodiment of sanity. So we would say all of us have what we call Buddha nature, and invoking the sacred presence of the Buddha is a way of invoking this sacred dimension that's innate to ourselves. So please don't think this has anything to do with something mystical or otherworldly or so forth. It's very much about touching a dimension, invoking a dimension that's innate to our own enlightened essence. So we'll just take 2-minute break if you need to just stretch for a moment, and then we'll begin. Thank you very much.
Also, after the meditation, we'll be having supper down at my place. If anyone cares to join us.
Thank you, Michelle. So somebody's asking, should out-breath be longer than the in-breath? Oh, never mind. Actually, actually, you know what? I could say never mind, but actually it's interesting because a long out-breath is actually very often quite helpful in terms of creating a non-distracted mind. So you can experiment with it, but of course the instruction itself is not really contingent on a long or short out-breath. It's more that our attention is on the out-breath. I always forget. Okay, we'll begin. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. Ah, as the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of independence. Magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne, lotus sun moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher's Lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent, he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders, and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world, and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Who hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed through beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teaching ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space. May you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance, no protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the 3 jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha. To you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yataho muni muni mahamunaya soha. Te yataho muni muni mahamunaya soha. Te yataho muni muni mahamunaya soha. Te yatao muni muni mahamunaya soha. Deyatao Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Deyatao Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Deyatao Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om 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 Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. From the Buddha's body, there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays, a wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, causing all the path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. And then the aspiration prayer of Maitreya. Oops. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas, endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma, mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence. I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those supreme among humans to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, and those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhamma Dhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings, no life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dhammatā where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity, endowed with the flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure. An ethics of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya, kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the flame Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun, may the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya sthitiya yavaccha jagata sthitihi Namastiti Bhuya Jagadukanata Akashasya Stiti Yavaccha Jagata Stiti Tavam Namastiti Bhuya Jagadukanata Tavam Namastiti Bhuya Jagadukanata Tavam Namastiti Bhuya Jagadukanata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. So thank you very much for joining us here.